Hi, this is Cédric Champeau. I'm working on a Groovy project, and today I would like to show you how you can set up your IDE to contribute on the Groovy project, because often people ask us how you can do that. And it's actually pretty easy using the Gradle task that we have made just for that. So let's show you how you can do that. Right. Okay, so the first step is basically to have a fork of the Groovy project on GitHub. So this is my fork, which is forked from groovy/groovy-core. And here you can copy the URL for your fork. So what I've done here is forking the repository and cloning on a local file system. So what I have in the Groovy core directory is the Groovy project. So I'm going to show you afterwards how it is organized, but basically it's just a single fork, and I've done that before the Hangout just because my internet connection is a bit slow, so it's easier for me to do that before. So I have cloned my repository, but before doing anything else, I'm going to add the upstream remote so that it's easier for you to contribute to Groovy just by pushing pull requests. So let's add the remote, call it upstream, and for upstream we need the URL of the original Groovy repository. Here it is. Okay. So setting up the IDE is actually very easy. All you have to do is to go into the Groovy core directory and type Gradle W IDE. Let's see how it goes. So if it's the first time that you do that, Gradle will download all the dependencies that IntelliJ and Groovy require for this to work. So in my case, I have everything local to my computer, so it will be quite fast to set up. But if you didn't do that, obviously you will have to download all the dependencies. So it will take a bit more time, but once it's done, really the setup will be pretty easy. So one thing you have to know is that to set up the IDE, in this case IntelliJ IDEA, you have to have the jar, the Groovy jar class pass. So the ID task that I'm running also compiles Groovy, at least the core compiler. And you have to do this once, and once it's done, normally you don't have to touch that anymore. Right, so build successful. So now what I can do is opening IntelliJ IDEA and select Open Project. Then I can choose my project, which is /temp Groovy core, and then the important part is to choose the IPR file, not the Gradle one. Even if IntelliJ has support for Gradle, in the case of Groovy, you should really use the IDE task because it does much more than what the IDE bundled support for Gradle is capable of doing. So let's select this one. Okay, so it seems to be good. It's scanning the project. Excellent. So now it's indexing. So while it's indexing, I can show you the project structure. So basically, what you will have is a Groovy core project corresponding to the main artifact that the Groovy project produces. So you have the source directory with main classes, etc., resources, the tests, everything, and you have a subproject directory with all the submodules that Groovy produces. So for example, if you want to work, say, on the JSON support, you have the JSON module, and here you have the sources for the JSON module, the test for the JSON module, etc. So everything about modules is in this subprojects directory, while Groovy core itself is directly inside the source. So now the IDE has loaded my project. I can show you that you can already select a sample build configuration. For example, I have set up automatically when you run the Gradle task to generate project, you have a task which creates the tests under the static type checking package, which is already created for you. So you can select this one, run it, and if the IDE setup is correct, it will compile the project, run the tests. And once you have figured out that this works, you're done. I mean, you have everything at hand to run project and work on a Groovy project. So while it's compiling, let's show, for example, one of the test classes that I'm going to execute. So say the type checker test for closures. Here we go. Okay, doing multiple things at once. Right. Let's increase the font. So what you can see is that the IDE is really set up to understand everything in the group project. So you have all those classes working with Groovy support, even if you are building Groovy. So this is the key point. You are working on the Groovy project, yet the IDE supports Groovy itself, and you will be able to do everything from within the IDE without having to rely on command line to run Gradle tasks, etc. So this is how typically I develop on Groovy. I mean, I work from the IDE, I work on a fork on different branches for every features, and once I'm done, I just make a sanity check with Gradle task to do that. So it's a Gradle task, for example, to run the task tests, which runs everything outside of the IDE just to make sure, even if it works in my IDE, that it will work outside of the IDE, typically on the CI server. So what you can see is that it takes some time to compile Groovy the first time you do that, but once it's done, it will be pretty fast. So you have a lot of classes to compile. So my computer is maybe, I would say, yes, it's 3 years old. So it's not as fast as it could be now, but within 5 minutes, not more, you have a setup running. Okay, so I hope that we will be finished soon. Meanwhile, I can maybe just try to put a breakpoint in one of those classes just to show you how you can debug from within the IDE. So it seems that Hangouts is eating a bit of my CPU because I have tested that just before and it was faster. So It's the demo effect, yes. So it's running. Okay, my tests are executing. It's all good. Okay, let's stop this one. Now I'm going to select this precise unit test and choose debug. And there. And you have everything from within the IDE to be able to debug your unit tests. So one of the cases is working on the documentation. So the Groovy documentation typically is now using AsciiDuctor for the literal part, so the text is using AsciiDuctor, but we're also using unit tests specific for the documentation. So all the documentation is written with unit tests which are really specific to those. So you find those in the source tree under the spec directory, and here you have the documentation. So I can show you, for example, the one I'm working on these days, which is the semantics one. So this is an AsciiDuctor file. So you have a plugin actually in IntelliJ that supports the syntax of AsciiDuctor, but I'm not using it just because it's slowing down a bit, just because it has to load JRuby in the background, etc. So I didn't want to have that. And this is a file that we edit, and in each file you have that kind of code, which is importing a snippet of code from a unit test. So you have the path to unit test, which is source spec test, and this is a unit test specific to this document. So I can open the type checking test, which is specific to the documentation, and there you can see all the unit tests. Now, if I want to run it, this one specifically, without having to run the full Groovy test suite, because obviously this is often not what you want to do. You want to test only your added test or your module, etc. So you don't want to pay the price of running a full Groovy build, which takes around, let's say, between 10 and 15 minutes, depending on your computer. So you don't want to pay that price, so you can just select your unit test and run it, and then all from within the IDE, and you're done. Executing all my tests. All good. So the last part is actually what can happen if you do something from the outside, such as going back to the Gradle project and say, I want to generate the documentation. Oops, this is an alias that I have. So I want to generate the documentation. I can do Gradle W. The daemon is, yeah, you can have it as an environment variable, whatever. So AsciiDuctor will parse all those files and generate the documentation. So it takes some time, around 1 minute, and when it's done, you can open the project, the output, which is in this one. It is in the target AsciiDuc directory, and then you have the files which are generated by this task. So let's see that. All done. So we have the target directory, and inside we have an AsciiDuc directory, And within this one, you have all the files for all the documentation. So I was working on core semantics.adoc, so I have a core semantics HTML file for that. So where is it? Let's list core semantics, and I can open that file. And you see that all the snippets that you have here are actually unit tests imported into ASCII adapter. So the whole Groovy documentation is actually tested. This is really important because we are writing a specification of the language, so we want everything written to be tested, and that to avoid that in the future we introduce a new feature and that it breaks somehow the specification. So everything, every snippet of code that you find in the documentation is tested. Right. So I was telling about one thing that can happen if you do some Gradle tasks, such as Gradle W clean. So you want to clean the output. And then you forget to do something which is important for debugging from within the IDE. Okay. And now I'm going to try, yes, to execute the test again. And what you can see is already that the IDE complains saying the Groovy SDK is not configured for module Groovy. Why is that? We use a hack to be able to run Groovy from the IDE and debug Groovy in the IDE, and that hack is having a Groovy jar on ClassPass. This makes the IDE happy, and it tries to understand that it's using Groovy, but in fact it will be using our output, not the Groovy jar. So you have to have a Groovy jar. If I try to run that, it will fail just because it doesn't find a Groovy jar. Right, fail. So if that happens, you can do Gradle W jar. I should use the daemon. Shouldn't take that long. It's only a dual core CPU that I have, so running Hangouts and compiling Groovy at the same time is probably not a good idea, but that's what I want to show. So let's wait. Almost done. Okay. Now the IDE will refresh. The little bar saying that I can't do anything disappears. I can run the test again. And it works. So basically, if you have a problem like the IDE complaining that it doesn't find the Groovy SDK, or that you have errors such as a missing import in some of the classes, say a Groovy core class like ASM class generator, you could have a lot of red inside this project. And if this happens, just try to run the Gradle jar task again, and often it just solves the problem. It's just the IDE messing up with the output. But in general, really, it's not a problem. And last, say you want to integrate with Git. It's already set up. So let's say that I am modifying this file, and I'm adding a log. Please don't submit any pull request with that. You can see that since the Git is already set up through the Gradle IDE task, you have nothing to do. You can already use everything from within the IDE, so it's really cool. Okay, so this was setting up your IDE just to work on a Groovy project. Don't hesitate to comment on the video and ask me more details if you have problems setting up, if you have problems finding where you should try to work on. But remember that if you want to contribute on some parts of the Groovy language, such as modules, you have the subproject directory, and if you want to work on documentation, basically it's sources spec, and you have a source spec directory for each module. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.